Despite my obvious position on relationships and how I view them for myself, I still, every now and then, get some guys who come to me for what might be a lack of a better description, relationship advice. Now, you probably know how I feel about advice in general, but I can make observations. And one thing I've noticed over the years is how our instincts sometimes sabotage us in terms of chasing after women, or even in the case of women chasing after men. Because I used to play the game years ago, in my 20s, in my 30s, etc., and eventually I got over it. But that's not the case for everybody. And as we must concede, as we all know, going your own way is quite simply not for everybody. There's no shame in that. It's neither good nor bad. It is what it is. So if you are on that path to quote-unquote find somebody, there's some things I have observed that might be of use. So today I want to talk about how our instincts sometimes sabotage how we approach things. The one thing is absolutely 100% clear, that dating, and more broadly all social interaction, is driven by looks. We all try to go for the quote-unquote most attractive person, whether they're male or female, whatever it might be. That is the number one on the list. Even as you are subconsciously telling yourself that's not the case, it always seems to be the case. And in a more primitive context, that probably made sense, because roughly speaking, that is a proxy test for genetic health, good immune system, or what have you. But we also have to understand that in former times, and certainly in primitive times, men and women did not spend that much time together, not like today. There was no scenario, for example, 10,000 years ago, where men and women were spending 40 or 50 years together, they didn't even live that long, in the same house, under the same roof, sharing chores, talking about bills to pay, and savings, and pensions, and things like that. That would have been completely alien. And so the prerequisites that went into quote-unquote mate selection back in the day, and by that I mean thousands of years ago, probably don't necessarily map terribly well into reality in the current day, which is to say there's a degree of the maladaptive there. And we've all heard this before, why don't you lower your standards? But usually when people say, why don't you lower your standards, you're too picky, they're not saying it with any additional information. They're just saying, you're too picky, lower your standards. But I think more often than not, aiming for purely attraction is a fatal flaw if it turns out that you're looking for a quote-unquote long-term relationship. Again, this is all instinctual. This is how we evolved. But just because our ancestors did it a certain way thousands of years ago does not mean it's necessarily the best method today. So we have this phrase, why don't you lower your standards, you're too picky. What does that really mean? There's actually a kernel of truth to that. You see, because attractiveness and beauty are the primary absolute that keep people motivated and in the game, they also are the factors that tend to make you as an individual, specifically an individual man, set aside, sweep aside any other considerations. And I think we've all been there to one degree or another. When I was in my 20s, one of my more attractive exes was a blonde-haired, green-eyed German female that I was, at the time at least, head over heels in love with. This is getting close to 20 years ago. And for better or worse, she had borderline personality disorder. Of course, by the time I found that out, it didn't really matter. The hormones were raging. It was a bit of a runaway situation. But retrospectively, I can think about various red flags that I might have seen that are obvious to me today, but were not that obvious back then. But she was really attractive, really pretty, and so I just said, I'll just look past that. Or I tried to rationalize it to myself at the time, thinking, oh, that's pretty cool. And I think people do that constantly because looks are number one, right? Everyone, even people who are conscious of this bias, still operates on this looks number one methodology. But here's where I think it short-circuits people's attempts at doing things. Number one, looks are great, but it's no guarantee they're actually going to get along. And oftentimes you end up in a situation, if you're lucky enough to quote-unquote get the girl, where the female in question might be very attractive, but you don't get along too well at all. And on top of that, you're making concessions all the time. There are a lot of issues. You're either fighting or she's just plain and simple difficult to get along with. And then what? Well, I guess she looks good. That's why you're together with her. We make these concessions all the time. My earliest long-term relationship, retrospectively, was completely asinine in my case, because I stayed with her for over 2 years, despite her having somewhat violent tendencies and being psychologically somewhat unstable. If I'm totally frank, because she cooked a mean meal, had massive knockers, and she was bestial in bed. Totally moronic in retrospect, but I was in my late teens, early 20s at the time. Suppose you could say that was an excuse. For one thing, if you are interested in pursuing relationships, something that I've lost interest in, you need to look at the long term. You need to look at stability. And again, just because somebody looks good or you think they look good doesn't mean you're going to get along or there's going to be any harmony there. All that means is you found somebody that you find attractive that might give you good genes if you decide to reproduce. But these days, relationships seem to go on longer than they used to a couple of thousand years ago. It's not quite as simple as it used to be. So using that primordial instinct to guide you and then subordinating everything and sublimating everything to that primordial instinct doesn't seem very wise to me. Saying you should go for ugly girls? No. I'm saying that if you have some sort of choice or you happen across some female that appeals to you, there's no reason to dismiss her outright, barring some obvious things like morbid obesity, just because she doesn't perfectly map onto your image of what you find attractive. And here's the thing, attractiveness fades. The desire to have sex with the same partner fades. All these things fade over time. So at the end of the day, you're left with someone who you either get along with or you don't. To the extent that I'm aware of successful relationships, and there are not many, I know a few, but they're piddling in number compared to the dysfunctional ones I know, none of those were really based on raw attraction. They were based mostly on common interests, the ability to get along, the ability to cooperate on some level without getting each other's face all the time and fighting. Really, that's what it came down to. The few instances of success I'm familiar with are just like that. Now, in one or two of these cases, the man actively chose a woman who was less attractive than the standard fare he might have pursued. And this makes perfect sense because each relationship displays a certain degree of asymmetry. If you are the underdog or the quote-unquote attraction equal, there's going to be that asymmetry, and it's going to be difficult to retain what you have. And in some cases, these men made rational decisions, for lack of a better way of describing it, and said, look, she's a point or two below what I normally would go for, but the trade-off is she's going to be more loyal, she's going to be easier to deal with, and lo and behold, they tend to be, because the asymmetry of power distribution in the relationship is in his favor. And that's an important point to make, because both men and women tend to be as loyal as the options available to them. A person with a lot of options, say a 9.5, is going to have a lot of opportunities to do what he or she wants. The likelihood that you're going to be able to retain that is thus vanishingly small. So it goes for everything. If a person has lots of options, there's going to be a lot of temptation. A person who's less attractive is going to have fewer options and therefore, at least potentially, value the object of the relationship more than somebody who can flit from one to the other without a problem and literally gets offers every day. So when psychology in terms of interaction is shaped by the options available, this applies to women too. Look at all these women in their hypergamy chasing these guys that are completely out of their reach. Yes, they might be able to have a one-night stand with them, best case scenario. They can never retain them. And this is because you'll see 5s or 6s or even 7s trying to go for 9.5s and near 10s, thinking that they can somehow nab them and retain them. But it's completely unrealistic. Now, on the other hand, men, I think, in general, are more reasonable and more rational. They can actually approach relationships, if they want to pursue them, that is, from a perspective that is not bound to hypergamy. And so when these young guys ask me what I think they should do, I'm just honest. I think that, yes, lowering certain standards is a useful tool in order to get access to other things that will improve a so-called relationship. Because when you're just operating off of that primal instinct, you're setting aside all the other considerations typically because you want that thing to work just because you find X female very attractive. And that is not a good approach. It might have been a good approach 5, 7, 10, 15,000 years ago, not so much now, especially in today's day and age where you have 5s and 6s thinking that they're 9s and 10s because they're delusional. That said, these are just some thoughts I have. These are my observations. They're by no means meant to be 100% accurate, but were I a young man and still interested in plying the field, those are some of the things I would do. I would not hyper-focus on what I find most attractive. I would look for other things because, one, you need to regulate the power asymmetry in the relationship, and there will, of course, always be one. Sometimes it's very asymmetrical, sometimes not. But as a man, you don't want to be in a situation unless you enjoy it. And there are some men like that. I've seen them. You don't want to end up in that situation. And you also want a situation where that person in question doesn't have a lot of options. But again, those are just my observations. I'm not in the game anymore. But for the young guys that come to me and ask me these questions, that's what I think. Everyone, until the next time, if I'm still alive, take care, and may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.